getting started. Today's class is just the isms of the mind. And this was, I think it was Mikhail's request of philosophers throw around ism words all the time, and especially in the philosophy of mind. And so we've got terms like functionalism, dualism, physicalism, materialism, and all too often people just assume we know what the hell we're talking about. And very often people use these terms differently. One will use one term, another will use a different term, and it gets very, very confusing. So let's just take a step back and spend a day talking about what all the isms are. And so that's literally all I want to do. So if at any point we want to go off on tangents, we want to do anything around any of these, that's what we'll be discussing. So the isms of the mind. And part of the reason that the isms of the mind is so confusing is that different isms and the divisions between different isms aren't always divisions that are responses to the same question. So to give an analogy from like discussions of government, we could say that a type of government, you might say that, say, a theocracy, an autocracy, a monarchy, and an oligarchy are all forms of government, but they don't actually answer this. They're not responses or types of government in the same ways. So the difference between an autocracy and an oligarchy. Anyone who took a government class, what's the difference between an oligarchy and a
theocracy is just basically, it's in Vatican, like the God is under everybody and the church is ruled by everything. Autocracy is basically the government when like the group of people there's just control all the branches of
Yeah, so that's oligarchy. Oligarchy is a group. Autocracy is one. It's just a single person ruling. So a theocracy and a monarchy are differences in styles of ruling or how you choose the leaders. A theocracy is basically the priest caste. A monarchy is a hereditary king-queen sort of issue. An oligarchy is a matter of how many people are in charge. So you could have a theocratic oligarchy, you could have a theocratic autocracy. So when you just talk about ways of governing, it can look like this is just a question of what way of governing are you dealing with? When in truth, it's asking two different questions. One is how many people, the other is how do we choose them or how they get in charge. In the same way with many of the isms, the isms of the mind, the difference between a substance dualist on the one hand and a materialist on the other is a different question than what separates someone like an eliminative materialist from a functionalist. And really, I think the way we can think of this is there's two main questions that govern how we decide on the isms. The first question is what type of stuff exists in the world? It's, to use the fancy philosophy term, it's an ontological question. And ontology is just the study of what exists. So this is going to be how many different types of substances are there, or how many different types of things are there, and what are they? The second question is a separate one. It is a question about truth makers. Does anyone know what a truth maker is, or have you heard this in any of your philosophy classes? It's kind of built into the term. It's what makes a statement true. So for instance, the truth maker of the statement, this marker is black, is whatever physical facts make it the case that this is a black marker. The truth maker of it's May 5th is whatever place around the globe you are combined with facts about the calendar. And so the second question of what are the truth makers of a statement like X believes that P? There's overlap between these two, but what we find is the questions of the substance and the isms that answer that question are different than this other question. And what we find is we can create kind of a hierarchy of where the different isms fall in. And so what I want to do is just discuss, basically there are three different answers that people have given to what type of stuff exists. And these three answers give us four of the isms we'll be discussing: materialism, substance dualism, and idealism. And then also tied in physicalism, which is its own separate thing that needs to be addressed by its own. So basically, the first question, though, is you come along, you ask, what type of stuff exists? And the first of the three isms we are going to discuss are answers to this question. So question one, what type of stuff exists? The first answer that can be given is materialism. The second answer is substance dualism. And then the third one we're going to be discussing is idealism. And then side note on physicalism. So the way you can think of these isms are all as giving answers to this question: what type of stuff exists? And number one, this first one, materialism, and idealism, both say there's only one type of thing. They both say everything is a particular sort of stuff. What does substance dualism say? How many types of stuff are there?
Substance dualism means and the mind and physical, mental and physical stuff do exist. Materialism means that just physical stuff exists, and idealism means that a mental stuff exists.
Yeah, so here's the basic idea. Materialism is probably in some ways, the simplest. It's not the one that is most baked into our society or our typical way of thinking, but the materialist position is basically the idea that the only stuff that exists is matter, understood in a very traditional sort of like flat-footed, matter is the stuff that like, this is matter, this is matter, this is matter. It's basically the idea that everything that exists, everything in the world is material, physical stuff. So it's all three-dimensional sort of things that you experience in your everyday life. And this sort of view in Western philosophy traces back to like the beginning of Western philosophy. Like the first guy they make you read in pre-Socratics was Thales, and he thought everything was water. Then there were like the atomists who thought that everything was made up of very tiny things that couldn't be divided any smaller. Might sound familiar. They were a few thousand years ahead of their time. But yeah, the idea is basically everything is matter. All the way down, there's nothing that isn't matter. Things that you might think aren't matter, or things that you might think exist that are not material, don't really exist. So that is what materialism is. If I were to describe most people in philosophy today, I'd say the vast majority of people fall into a materialist camp of one type or another. The other two are less popular, and most like people in science and most people in psychology are going to be materialists to some degree in the sense of how much stuff exists. There are going to be some vagaries and things, but that's basically the first one. Now, substance dualism. Who's the name in philosophy that's most closely
Descartes.
Yeah, Descartes. Descartes is the substance dualist extraordinaire. And he is also, I mean, if you want to come up with another large group of substance dualists, look at, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, anything that believes in a soul that is eternal and lives beyond the body. I guess Hinduism would be the same way. Any type of thing in which there's a type of stuff that is not merely physical. And the idea is behind substance dualism that, well, why is it that substance dualism got off the ground? There's a few different reasons. Some of them are historical, having to do with the way that like Christianity and the church dominated Western Europe, and then the way that Western Europe became like the dominant force in the type of the analytic and continental traditions of philosophy that we would typically study in the United States. So, but the main motivation behind substance dualism is just this idea that there's certain types of things that just don't seem able to be explained in terms of physical stuff. Things like pain, things like what its likeness. And we'll come back to this a bit more when we talk about property dualism. But the basic idea is that there has to be a second type of stuff, a second type of material, a second type of not everything can be material. There has to be some other non-material. Of course, this leads to all sorts of problems. What are some of the problems with substance dualism from any of these classes you've had? Anyone?
Where is the spatial location of the mental?
Yeah, it's basically, the idea is we want to think that if we're going to be substance dualists, we still, and this goes back to like our free will class, we want to be able to say that the things in the mind change what's going on in the world. Like there's something about my mind that makes my arm move. But our very notion of cause is a notion of physical things interacting. So how on earth could the mind affect the physical world? It seems like this is just like a non-starter. It doesn't really make that much sense. So that's the idea behind substance dualism. It's this other idea. Now, idealism is the third view. And idealism is really probably the least common view. Because with materialism, it's kind of easy, like we see things in 3D, we feel things. It just seems pretty obvious that there is material stuff. Substance dualism, it seems like there are at least, and built into our very idea of like the soul leaving the body and all those sorts of things, at the very least, we aren't denying the existence of material stuff. We're just adding on this other type of substance. And there are some questions around it, but yes, idealism is an extreme view that all that exists is the mental. There is no physical reality. This view is not that common, and there aren't many people who hold it or have even held it. If I'm remembering my history of philosophy closely or at all, then the most strict example of an idealist was, I can never spell his name right, but Bishop Berkeley, who we changed the name and gave it to a school and a city in California. But yeah, Bishop Berkeley, he believed that everything was the mind. The other type of idealist, or the other person whose name is often associated, why do not we have to switch to red? No, the other name that is often associated with idealism is Kant, but it's a special type of idealism in Kant's case, Kantian idealism. And what Kant's view was, does anyone remember Kantian idealism or want to give it a stab just so you don't have to listen to me ramble on? Because I think for anyone who's done it, I think spending the time to discuss what Kantian idealism is worth doing just because it's such a fascinating view. And Kant is one of those people I think is just worth reading in his own right. Anyone remember, or how many of you have had to read Kant in something? Any of your classes? Okay, a few of you.
So basically, Kant argued that the space and time are merely formal features, and there are two. So basically, he defined the things themselves, which exist independently of us, and properties of relations among them.
Yeah. So just adding on to that, yeah, the basic idea is. And Holland, I confess, I have a bit of a Kantian idealist tendencies, but yeah, it has some really strange implications. The basic idea, though, for those of you who are familiar, is basically what Kant said is he didn't deny the existence of an external world. What he said, though, was that the external world as it exists in itself is not something that a human being can even grasp. The things that we know, the things that we experience, are by their very nature channeled through our minds, so that maybe there is an experience, a thing out there that's separate from the mind, but we can never think it. The only things we will ever have access to are what you can think of as what happens when the physical world combines with these intrinsic sorts of, I guess, mental abilities, or basically the tendencies within the mind to organize the unorganized experience. And what he says is that some of the most basic elements of our experience, things we take to be fundamental features of matter, are really mental things imposed on the matter. So things like time, the actual world beyond the mental, is that the things beyond the mental are not in any way a thing we objectively experience. It's rather just that we experience time because we project time You can almost think of it as, why is there time and experience? Well, because we bring it with us when we encounter reality. Same with space. And so Holland says, this makes sense from a cognitive science perspective. I study perception and sensation, and nothing we perceive is truly a reflection of reality. And that's spot on. This is one of the reasons that I find myself drawn to a certain degree to this type of Kantian idealism, is because in cognitive science, what we find is things like the way we experience color is the way that our mind grasps light reflecting. And the way we experience 3D is the way that our mind reconstructs what is projected to it. And this goes back to what I was talking about in the modularity unit, about how the nature of the sense organs means that it has to be a reconstruction of the world as it exists. And so Kant's idea is that when you know something, you know that it's gonna, a certain amount of time passes, your knowledge is by its very existence somewhat material. Or not somewhat material, it's not just material, it's somewhat mental, because the only things you can ever interact with are by their very nature mental stuff. So it's like, so he's kind of this weird view where for him, it doesn't really even make sense to speak in terms of substance dualism, because the very idea of substance is for him a notion that is mental by its very existence. But at the same time, he wants to say there's something out there. It's beyond our grasp of even what that thing could be, because we can't think of it except as processed through a human mind, which brings things like time and space to the table and affects it. All right. So does this first ism divide make sense? The materialism, substance dualism, idealism divide of just how we divide up stuff this way. Now we have to go on a little side thing, which is our dear friend physicalism. And by here, I don't want to talk, physicalism kind of has to be treated a little bit differently than the others. And the reason it does is because materialism, substance dualism, and idealism all have very clear meanings, or very clear things that they're referring to. The issue is that the word physicalism gets used differently by different philosophers and has a history distinct from the word materialism that leads to some confusions. And there's a reason that this one is worth describing in its own. So everyone, side note, use-mention distinction. Are you all familiar with it? It's mainly in the philosophy of language, but it's worth just highlighting here because it's something that's useful in your own thought. The use mention. Are people familiar with this term, this phrase, the use mention distinction? Anyone not? Okay. The idea of the use mention distinction is with language, you can think of, there's two different things. There's the word itself, and then there's the thing the word is talking about. So when you're speaking in everyday English, it's not always clear whether you're discussing the term, a way of putting it is the thing it's about, or to use the philosophy term, the referent of the term, or whether you're talking about the term or word itself. So for instance, I can say things about whales, like I can say whales are mammals. When I'm doing that, I'm using the term whale to talk about whales. However, I can also say something like whale has 5 letters. When I'm doing that, I'm not talking about whales. I'm not using the word whale. I'm rather mentioning the word whale and then saying something about the word. So the reason that physicalism is a confusing thing is that the word physicalism, if I mention the word physicalism, it gets used in multiple different ways. But because these different ways are all spelled the same and look the same and are pronounced the same, what ends up happening is we end up confused as to what exactly it is we are talking about. What are we using this term to discuss? So this is just a common way of talking about language. And the use mention distinction is it's very unclear. And the more you look at it, the messier it gets. But as a first pass, it's a really useful way of differentiating and making clear when you're talking about the language itself and when you're using the language itself to talk about the things beyond the language. So The reason that physicalism, I'm talking about this, is that the way the term gets used, the history of the term physicalism is distinct from the history of the term materialism. And it's different in a way that sometimes has led people to use these two words interchangeably, and other times has led people to use them in the same way. So as a matter of fact, 9 times out of 10, if you are reading a philosophy of mind paper, physicalism and materialism are meaning the same thing. What somebody who's saying physicalism is doing is they are just saying there's one type of substance, the material or the physical. I'd say 95% of the time when someone uses physicalism, that's what they mean. However, it's not always the case. And there's 2 different reasons for this. First off, Carnap and logical positivists. So Carnap and the logical positivists were the first one to use physicalism. This term has been around since, in another language, we're talking since the ancient Greeks. Physicalism as a word was only started to be used in the 1930s or 40s for a strange view within Western philosophy that basically only existed between 1920 and 1960, called logical positivism. If you want me to go down the logical positivism rabbit hole right now, I can. If nobody cares about logical positivism because it's not a very dominant theory now, and it's not directly related to the isms, we don't have to. I just want to say that part of the reason that physicalism exists and is sometimes used differently than materialism is it was sometimes used in this tradition of logical positivism in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So that's one thing. Do people want me to, like, this is honest, I'm happy to go into positivism. I'm not an expert on it, but I can give the general gist, or we can just move on, skip all those annoying, weird positivist thoughts. Anyone have any strong views?
If it's possible, can you just explain logical positivism?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah. So the basic idea was logical positivism was this view that grew up originally, I think, in Austria and then moved to Germany and then came to the United States when a lot of the people who were logical positivists happened to be Jewish and flee Nazi Germany. They came to the United States. The basic idea behind logical positivism was this view that we want philosophy to be like genuine science. And this is really a lot of his intellectual history, is people wanting their own field to be more scientific. And what logical positivists did when they looked at science is they found that what scientists would do is give basically verification conditions of what would make one of their scientific claims true and what would make one of their scientific claims false. So for instance, a scientific claim in physics might be something like this. The apple weighs 10 grams. And what you would do is, in a scientific sentence, it wasn't just that this was meaningful. It was that you could say exactly what it would take for this to be true and exactly what this would take for this to be false. So you knew like what state of affair you could point to the fact in the world that would positively identify what it was for the apple to weigh 10 grams. It was for you to take a scale or a balance, put 10 grams on one side and an apple on the other, and they would balance out. You could give a very straightforward experiential definition of what it was for it to be true or false. And so what logical positivists said is that level of rigor, that level of certainty, we also should have that in philosophy. So the only sentences that should be meaningful and we should be concerned with are things that we can give the particular cases in which it would be true and the particular experiential difference if it were false. So a sentence like a whale is a mammal. Well, you could, in this case, give a nice clear definition of what it would take to prove it's a mammal. Well, you would just have to show that it has hair and yada yada. But what about a sentence like God exists? A logical positivist, or another one that was one of their favorites, was killing is wrong. The idea behind logical positivism was that you couldn't, for this sentence to be meaningful, you had to be able to give a definition of this that could be verified like a science statement could be. So in the same way that you could give a demonstration of putting an apple on one side of a balance and a weight on the other, and that is your verification that the apple weighs 10 grams. If this sentence is true or false, if it's a meaningful sentence capable of being true, we'd have to be able to see a difference between, there'd have to be some experience we could point to that would demonstrate that either killing is wrong is true or that killing is wrong is false. In the same way, you'd have to be able to point to some scientific type experience that God exists or God does not exist. And what the logical positivists came to do was claim that many of the statements that we thought we understood and we thought could be true or false were not, and are really, in the sense of true or false, meaningless. It's just kind of a game. And so this goes back to what Holland was talking about a few weeks back with emotivism. Many, like A.J. Ayer, who was one of the most famous positivists in England, he said that he took an emotivist view on moral terms. He said that something like, you can't tell me what the facts are that make something wrong or differentiate between the wrong things and the right things. So when I say that is wrong, there must be some other language game I'm playing. There must be something else going on. And really what I'm doing is I'm just emoting that I don't like murder. I'm just going, boo, murder. Because murder is wrong or killing is wrong, that's not the type of thing that could be true or false because it doesn't have conditions. So that's what logical positivism is. And so the original use of physicalism was this idea that a sentence about the mind was verifiable in terms of physical facts. And that so if it were the case that something like X believes P is true, then for that to be true, there would have to be some physical fact that you could point to as corresponding to this or as verifying the truth of this. You'd have to be able to point to what physical conditions would make it true and what physical conditions would not make it true. Now, so it was originally a linguistic idea. It was this idea about what makes a sentence like this true. These days, logical positivism is dead, more or less, thanks to Quine. I could go down that rabbit hole too, but that's, I don't want to two-dogma anyone unless you really want me to two-dogma you. But the basic idea is, these days, because verificationism has kind of died, and when you see the term physicalism, it's more or less going to mean the exact same thing as materialism. The only other thing, though, and here's the thing to make the physicalism thing even more complicated, is sometimes people use physicalism to differentiate itself from materialism. And so they basically, there's a small group of people who have taken this term, which was originally used for something else. So I'm mentioning physicalism right now, not using it. And they use it to differentiate between views that believe the only thing that exists is matter and views that believe the only things that exist are the things that are talked about in physics. And why is this different? Well, because modern physics allows for all sorts of force fields and time-space continuums and 18 dimensions, many of which are distinct from the notion of matter that was used by somebody like, the early users of matter, the early materialists in ancient Greek, different from the notion of matter and space and time that we find in someone like Newton, different from the notion of matter as was used in early modern philosophy. So basically, the word physicalism gets used in 3 different ways. Most of the time that it gets used, it's being used as a synonym for materialism, where basically all that exists is the sort of stuff that gets studied in physics. Now, sometimes people use it to refer to a particular view held by people like Rudolf Carnap, A.J. Ayer in the 30s, 40s, 50s, that had a view that was tied in with this now dead view called logical positivism. And then the third use is sometimes people use it to say, my version of thinking there's only one type of substance is distinct from the type that was held by the early moderns who thought physical matter didn't have empty space in it. And now we know, thanks to physics, things are really complicated. So that's why physicalism is a monstrous, evil, confusing sort of thing within philosophy. But most of the time, if you see this or this, it just means the only things that exist are the sorts of things that you could study in physics. This is saying there's a special other thing beyond, and this is saying the things we thought exist in physics aren't really out there. They're either entirely or at least partially in the mind. So that's our first ism. And this is really the question, what type of stuff exists or what's out there? All right, are we on board with those isms? We good with these isms? All right. Let us divide, let's move on to the next set of isms. And these are the isms that, because they're answering different questions, there can be some lack of clarity over how these isms correspond to the ones we just talked about. But generally speaking, you can think of it like this. We have dualism of the substance variety, materialism, and dualism, materialism, idealism. Most of the other isms that we see within philosophy of mind are generally within or underneath a general view of materialism. And so every other ism we're going to be discussing today are people who would in some sense identify themselves as materialists. And they identify themselves as materialists in this certain sense that it's generally thought of in terms of, well, this one's somewhat confusing because property dualism hurts my head and I still don't quite know what to wrap my head around with it. But the basic idea is that most of the people who exist today and the other isms we can classify under here would be classified as materialism. And they'd be classified as materialism because these people think that at the end of the day, the only things that can have properties, the only things that a certain predicate, so it's things like is blue, is angry, the stuff underlying all of this is ultimately just going to be materialist stuff. And within this, what we find is there are different views about answers to the question. The question that divides these materialists is not how much stuff exists, but what makes it true that X believes that P. And so they all agree that at the end of the day, the only stuff that's out there is physical. It's just that this question here is a different one from the question, what stuff exists? And there are basically four different answers to what makes it true that X believes P is true. The first view is going to be, and this one is kind of, the ones at the end are, what did I just do? There we go. Give me 1 second to make sure my light stays on. All right, there we go. Eliminative materialism. This view is this view is identity theory. This view is predicate dualism, i.e. functionalism. And this is property dualism. All right, so what is the difference between these views? Well, they're all differences to the answers to the question, what makes it true that X believes that P? So working So the question then is, where X believes that P is like, I have a belief. We're trying to understand what makes it true. So imagine we agree it's true. I believe the sun is hot. The question is, what makes that the case? What is the truth maker of my having the belief that P? And there are 4 different answers we can give. The first answer is the eliminative materialist view, eliminativism. And that view kind of denies the first claim. It denies that there's anything that makes it true that X believes that P. So this one kind of separates from the others, where what an eliminative materialist is going to say is these statements are never true. It's never true that I believed that P. Rather, what we're going to do is eliminate any talk like this and just in our science do it in terms of neuroscience. These statements are not true. So that should sound familiar from earlier in the semester. The second one, does anyone know what identity theory is?
It means that brain is identical to the mental.
Yeah. So the idea of identity theorists, and identity here means with the equal sign. So in the same way that like 1 plus 1 is, or 1 plus 2 is identical to 3. In the same way, any true statement like this, there will be some particular mental state it corresponds to. And so the main difference between an identity theorist and an eliminative materialist is an eliminative materialist denies that these statements are true. Instead, we're replacing these statements with brain talk, with neuroscience talk. An identity theorist, by contrast, says, no, these statements are true, but what makes them true are facts about a particular brain. So if I believe that P, there is a type of brain state, a type of thing that corresponds to believing that P. So the idea would be, if I have, say, belief X, to have that belief is just to be in brain state 1, where this is described in physical terms. However, if you were if you were to ever have the belief X, to have the belief X would for you to have to be in the exact same brain state. If I believe that the sun is hot, then when you're believing that the sun is hot, your brain is in the exact same physical state that my brain was in when I had that belief. So there's a one-to-one correspondence between what's going on in the brain and what's going on in the beliefs. Does that make sense of just what this idea is? The idea is that just like materialism, ultimately, it's all a matter of physical. The only things that are true, false, exist are physical reality, but any brain state just is identical. It's just a different way of describing the very same thing. It's like saying that, calling me David or Professor or Neely, all of those are different names for the exact same thing. In the same way, the belief that the sun is hot and brain state 1 are just different names for the exact same state of affairs. And on this view, anyone who's in that brain state will have to be in that same physical state. It's the exact same thing. All right, I'm going to pause for a second because Michelle has to leave, and I'm going to pause the recording because no one. So Holland, I will explain the difference from eliminative materialism in a second, because that's a really good point, and I often get confused on the difference between eliminative materialism and identity theory. So let's pause. So, what's the difference between eliminative materialism and identity theory? In some ways, there's not much at all, in that they both think at the end of the day, science is going to come down to brain stuff. The major difference is that how they would respond to this question, what makes it true that X believes that P? An identity theorist is going to answer this question by saying, when somebody believes that the sun is hot, they are in brain state X. Brain state X is what makes it the case that X believes that P. That's all it is. An eliminative materialist is going to reject the question outright. They're going to say that there's a presupposition here that is not followed. So in particular, what a Churchland would say is nothing makes it the case that X believes that P, because beliefs aren't real, and anything we think we can say about beliefs aren't real, and nothing is useful. So what a identity theorist is going to do is basically try to say that we keep folk psychology around. We just accept that all folk psychologists are doing is talking about brain states. And eliminative, so when you say John believed that the sun was hot, therefore he believed something was hot, what you're saying is there was a particular brain state. Let's just draw up a brain here. Oh no, I just erased my magical, there's a big spot here that I can't write on because it's bright. So what they're going to say is an identity theorist will say that if we were to actually like draw up what it is for someone to have the belief that the sun is hot and from there conclude something is hot, what they do is, here's a brain, there's activation here, and then that causes a brain with activation here. An eliminative materialist is going to say, no, there's like, this might be true. That might be what's going on in this case, but you can't speak in terms of beliefs, desires. So in some sense, they agree that everything is a matter of brains. But on the other hand, they fundamentally disagree about what we should do with all the things that we thought were true for years. A materialist is going to say, we need to start over. An identity theorist is going to say, we take folk psychology and we work with it and we continue from there, and we just try to find the brain states that correspond to it. So there's very close relationship here, but all right, so what's the best way of putting this? I'm trying to think how to explain this because this is a really tough thing to really wrap your head around in terms of, yes, the eliminative materialists dismissed these statements as fundamentally misguided and not corresponding to anything we'd want in science. This is an illusion. This is like saying witches cook people's ears. I mean, it's a thing you can say, but just like witches, beliefs aren't real. All there are is anyone who talked in this way was fundamentally mistaken. An identity theorist doesn't think we were fundamentally mistaken. We just didn't understand what was underlying it. So yeah, they basically want to start over and just talk in terms of neuroscience. They think that psychology as it exists today, talking in terms of your childhood causing you to have certain beliefs, is not a science, can never be a science, needs to be thrown out. All we can do is neuroscience. But don't they think that those statements are important for understanding the implication of the brain? Those beliefs cause, so what they'd say is, as a matter of fact, beliefs, I mean, here's what happens. Certain brain states do cause things in the physical body and the physical world. But those things, those brain states, it's an illusion to think that beliefs are doing any work. There's, no. What's going on is brain state 1 corresponds to brain state 2 in a certain way. And really, when you are doing psychology and you think you're discovering scientific connections between beliefs and stuff, you're just making stuff up. You've got a fake science that you thought was good. You're basically just doing alchemy. You're coming up with something you thought was good, but isn't.
So just about the Holmes question. So can we say that eliminative materialists just say to just avoid the mental terms?
Yeah.
So basically the states are the same. The brain states are identical to the mental states, but just avoid the mental state terms.
And also there's a practical difference here where an identity theorist is going to try to use our everyday. So in some ways it's an actual like sociological difference here. Where an eliminative materialist is just going to think our common sense way of approaching the mind is not a good practical way of beginning. We have to start from scratch. An identity theorist is, as a sociological fact, going to begin from common sense and try to find what brain states correspond to our common sense terms. I think it's more like if you are studying emotions or beliefs, you are studying the results of brain states, which can still be helpful. So that right there, this idea of if you're studying emotions or beliefs, which can be the results of brain states, that's going to be an identity theorist and a eliminativist. Neither of them would agree to that. They're going to say that no, if you are studying emotions and beliefs, if you're an identity theorist, what you're studying is just the brain state. To be in fear is just the brain state. An eliminative materialist is going to say, you might think you're studying emotions and beliefs, but you're wrong. Get out of here. You're wasting your time to even speak in terms of emotions and beliefs. Really what you're doing is studying brain state XYZ, and you're calling it an emotion, which is just misleading, misguided, and going to lead to a lot of confusion. Now, predicate dualism or functionalism. This is the view that is most similar to what Colin just said. The idea that emotions or beliefs, you are studying the result of brain states, which is still helpful. Now, functionalism is the dominant view and also a very, very tricky view to wrap your head around without putting it in the right context. Because at the end of the day, functionalists are materialists, but they're materialists of a certain variety. They believe that the only, is it back to being unblurry? Let me stop the camera. The bottom is blurry. Okay, let's see if I point it down. Is it working? Are we back at all?
I can see everything.
Okay. All right. Then I have no idea why it's being like this today. It might be that all my markers are dead and I'm stuck with red. So that says eliminative materialism, identity theory, predicate dualism or functionalism, and then property dualism. Now, predicate dualism or functionalism. The best way to differentiate the difference here is that, I need to figure out the settings so the whole board stays nicely lit. But for now, we'll just push ahead with this. The way to think about it is in terms of see if I can do this. Where is the word supervenience so I spell it correctly? Supervenience. The basic difference between an identity theory and a functionalist or predicate dualist is a difference about what supervenes on what. Now, what does that mean? What is supervenience? For one thing to supervene on another is basically for a change. So imagine two properties. The best way to do that is just with a quick example. Let's see if I can find this. Dot matrix picture. All right. Let's see if I can get a good dot matrix picture. All right, here we go. Open image in new tab. And then share my screen. Where is it? Okay. Is this coming up for everyone now? It should be an image of a bunch of dots that are in the shape of the Earth.
Yes.
Okay, so when you look at this image, there's a sense in which it's an image, it's two different things. On the one hand, it is a depiction of the Earth. On the other hand, it's just a bunch of dots. So what we say is there are two things that are true of it. One, it's a bunch of dots. And two, this is of the Earth. What we can say is that the image of the property being of the Earth, or the predicate, so predicate is just the like verb part of the sentence, the property part. So like, is a cat, that's a predicate that could be applied to say Meowth. Meowth is a cat. The predicate is it's a cat. So picture of the Earth is a predicate of this picture that supervenes on a separate predicate of it made of dots. You say that the predicate of the Earth supervenes upon made of dots. And what that means is that if there's a change in this lower or in this higher order one, if this changes so that it's no longer of the Earth, or if it's no longer accurate and a New Zealand moves, any change at this level has to be corresponding to a change at this level. So if this were to cease to be of the Earth, the dots themselves that the picture is made of would have to change. However, it doesn't have to go in this other direction. If you change just one of the dots and made them blue, it would still be the case that this is of the Earth. So the idea here is that with this dot matrix, the property of being a picture of the Earth or of geography is a distinctive property that supervenes on the dots that there are. And so functionalism is a view about the supervenience relations between physical facts and mental statements, and what the place of those mental statements is in our science. So the basic idea is, I'm gonna actually erase this so I have a little more room. This is a statement that's true. I believe that it's 5/5. That is a true statement. And here's the predicate, believe that it's May 5th. Now, this fact, this statement, for me to have this belief, it's going to supervene on some brain state. And if I were to cease to believe this, if I were to now believe something different, namely that tomorrow, say I have the belief that it's 5/6, my brain state would have to change as well. But according to a functionalist, so the token state I'm in, my token belief that it's 5/5 is going to supervene on a token brain state in my mind. But what a functionalist is going to say is that, unlike an identity theorist who's going to say that there's a type of belief state that is associated with a type of brain state, a functionalist is going to say there is no underlying brain state that corresponds to this. Rather, while it is true that when I believe that it's this date, there is some brain state underlying it that this supervenes on, it is not the case that this is referring to a brain state. This is referring to a functional state. And what a functional state is while each individual token of that type of belief or token of that sort of thing is going to supervene on a brain state, the type itself is not equal to any type of physical state. It is equal to a functional state. To have a belief is to stand in a certain sort of mental causal relation. And in your particular case, there will be some brain state underlying it. But when I have this belief, and it's true that I believe that it's 5/5, when you have this belief, yes, there is some brain state underlying it, but it's a different brain state because you and I have different brains.
But this is an objection called multiple reasonability. So
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the idea of that. The multiple realizability argument is a reason to argue for functionalism as opposed to identity theory. So what identity theory and functionalism agree upon is, if you concentrate on a particular person, you just focus on a single individual at a single moment in time, an identity theorist and a functionalist will give you a similar answer of, both will agree there is a particular brain state that underlies this belief state. And if the belief state changed, there'd have to be a change in the underlying brain state that was responsible for this. What they disagree on is when you start comparing across people or across yourself in time. An identity theorist believes that you can make law-like descriptions of the brain state that corresponds to the belief state. So an identity theorist would say, yeah, the belief that it's 5/5 corresponds to the brain state XYZ, and the belief that it's 5/6 corresponds to the brain state ABC. A functionalist is going to say, no, no, no. While yes, a particular person who's having this belief might be in brain state XYZ, because this belief is a functional notion, I can believe that it's 5-5. You can believe that it's 5-5. An alien whose brain was made out of or a computer could believe that, like a supercomputer, self-aware alien robot with a totally different brain could believe that it's 5-5, means that we have to come up with a different view of what the belief is. So essentially what they're saying is that there are two types of predicates. There are two types of things that can be true of a human being. There's a different type it's a different type of predicate between a belief and a brain state. And while yes, as a matter of fact, anytime you are in this belief, there's going to be something going on in your head that is responsible for that. There's no one brain state that corresponds to. Another classical example to illustrate this that people talk about is hurricanes. So the SEP article compares functionalism to the notion of a hurricane. Because if you actually look at like a molecular weather-based level, we all know what a hurricane is. And it's meteorologists are able to make accurate predictions about hurricanes, where they're going to strike, what type of year they come in. But on a physical level, and every individual hurricane that exists, there's some physical facts about the air pressure and the spinning and everything else that underlies that hurricane. You couldn't have a hurricane without swinging stuff around. But if you actually look at individual hurricanes and what's doing the physical changes, different hurricanes are very different. And there's no one type of weather state which leads to a hurricane. It's rather that if something goes from being a hurricane to not a hurricane, yes, there's going to be a change. It supervenes. You can go in this direction, but you can't go the other way. Just because the physical properties change doesn't necessarily mean you no longer have a hurricane. And so this goes back to Fodor's idea of, and the reason why functionalists go functionalist is they think that if you just resort to brain states, you're missing out on a lot of useful, valuable information. Just like if we said that we could, underlying all hurricanes are physical facts. So really, whenever a hurricane comes along, what we need to instead be talking about is in terms of the physical movement of the air molecules. Well, no, we don't do that, because at the end of the day, what the exact physical underlying of a hurricane is a lot less important than are your shutters strong enough to keep the house in place? Is your house going to float away? So in the same way, with a belief, what matters is not the brain state. When we're doing the science, we all know that underneath it, there's something in a brain. And if I changed my brain around, it might affect my beliefs. And if my belief changes, something changes in the brain. But when we're doing the science, looking for the laws, we have to do it in terms of the functional notions. And so that's the core idea of functionalism.
And then a quick question, we still have time. Why the philosophical zombie experiment is an objection to the functionalism?
The general idea behind the zombie argument, the Mary argument, all of these arguments are basically, here's the best way of putting it for now, is, let me draw this up. And I'm going to follow up on this a bit more next Wednesday, just because it'll make a little more sense once we've talked about qualia and once we've talked about zombies and all that stuff. But the basic idea is it's the best way of putting this. We talked about the dividing line between a functionalist and an identity theorist on one side. But then when you go from predicate theorist or predicate dualist, which is functionalist, versus property dualist. The basic idea here is that a property dualist wants to go farther. A predicate dualist or a functionalist thinks that we can have a complete view of what the mind is if we just allow ourselves to have functional states that supervene on top of physical states. What the zombie argument and everyone else who's a property dualist wants to say is, if we're going to give an account of the mind, functionalism doesn't go far enough. So the disagreement is about what is there, or what types of things can there be, and can functionalism capture all the differences that there are? So, and I need to remind myself of all the details of the zombie argument, so I'll read up on that. But the basic idea is supposed to be that if you look at a zombie, and the way they're acting, and the way you give a functional characterization of a zombie, and the way you give a functional characterization of a non-zombie, and this is the philosophical notion of a zombie, then a functionalist has to say that the zombie and the non-zombie are identical mentally speaking, because they're functionally in the same functional states that are playing the same functional roles. The issue is that the argument's supposed to go, but that's illogical. That's not right. Clearly, there's something that the zombie and the not zombie have different, mentally speaking. So clearly, a functionalist doesn't capture the entirety of the mind. That, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, is the general idea of the argument. Now, what exactly makes property dualism? Rather than attempting to cram this into 2 minutes, we will save our last ism for next Wednesday when we jump in on Mary, and we jump in on the inverted spectrum, and I read up on my zombies again. But I'm pretty sure that's why it's an argument. It's not denying, I'm pretty certain that, like Chalmers, any of these other property dualists, they're not going to deny most of the things in cognitive science. It's just that they're saying that it's not sufficient. You over here, who want to do things in terms of predicates and say everything is a functionalist state, you don't capture every element of what it is to be mental. There's something you're missing. You need to bring in the what it's likeness, the qualia, that is different in these 2 cases. So yes, sure, you can be right in a lot of cases. You just don't capture everything. And we want a theory of the mind, not a theory of most of the mind. I think that's why it's an argument against it. It's not denying most of the functionalist claims. It's just denying that the functionalist gets all of it. Any other, we have 1 minute left. Does anyone have final questions, comments, concerns, feelings on any of this stuff? Again, Monday I'll send out a very short reading on why it's the case that we're stressed all the time, and how basically our ancient fear responses that evolved in one type of world really don't serve us well in this world. And why the fact is that when you get an email from your boss, you have the exact same response that you'd have had if a tiger showed up on your doorstep. And why is this the case? And why does this lead to overthinking, stress, extreme amounts of depression, and all things like this? And then on Wednesday, we'll jump back in on this very philosophy of mindy, and I will send out the Frank Jackson's Mary and the SEP article on inverted spectrum. And we will discuss property dualism and all that sort of fun jazz. We good? Thank you all for being great today. This was a super interesting, let me stop the recording as I just talk about how, okay, goodbye people on the